schools. I would point to some charter schools. And yes, I'll point to such as where Barb is working and others like her. Although I don't think it's just as public education does not have uniform results, homeschooling doesn't have uniform results either. And so what we need to do is find the best of each and then promote it and let each go to where they need to be.
And, unfortunately, we do tend to come up with, and this may be attributable to, our news society that sensationalizes everything, but we do hear about all the negatives and not the positives. And as an example, numerous stories have emerged, and these are just the ones we know about, of teachers seducing students for sex. So my question for you, Anne, why should we entrust our children's education to a system that fails to prevent such attacks on them?
Brent, the situation you mentioned with teachers being accused of such an act, I want to go back to something that was said a moment ago about how the public school system had devolved. I don't think that it's the public school system that has devolved to a somewhat low level in some arenas of life. It's our society. And what you have to realize is that the people who come to school, public or otherwise, every day, come and bring with them the problems that exist in our families, in our societies, and often schools whose only mistake was accepting everyone are the ones who get the blame for all the things that we need to work on out in our communities and in our homes. If it weren't for public schools where 90% approximately of children attend in America, I don't know who would take all the children and never turn any children away and help them get from where they are, wherever that may be, to a better place. We owe a lot to our public school system because that's what teachers and principals and staffs at those schools do every day. It's public schools where we assimilate our immigrants. It's public schools where we teach them how to become an American and what are the things we find in common as Americans. And as much respect as I have for any parent and their decision about where to educate their child, and I do stand up for that, I do know that when 90% of your kids go to public schools, that all of us have an interest in coming together to figure out how to have the best public schools we can. The reason we have that interest, I believe, Brent, is that we all want to live in an educated society. We all want people to go to the polls and vote. We all want less crime. We all want a better economic environment. And starting tomorrow, the parents of millions, tens of millions of kids simply cannot start homeschooling. The ones who can have that right, certainly, but it's not going to happen because we know that our parents, our citizens, Americans are struggling right now in an economy where they're just trying to survive. Most of them are not in a position tomorrow to start educating their kids themselves. That's where our public school system comes in, and I think we all need to work together regardless of our opinion about what would make it better and work to do exactly that. We need to listen to each other. We need to have thoughtful dialogue. We need to find the things that will make schools the best they can be and, yes, improve them, improve our dropout rate, make sure more kids are graduating and going into college and career paths.
Well, let's dialogue on that. Let me toss that over to you, Barb, and everything. And how do you feel hearing that and everything, that, that you just can't have everybody turn over and start homeschooling their children?
I think probably a huge majority of the populace that is not doing it now would be able to and would just love it if they could experience it. I do think that, in going back to the federal and the states and the government involvement, the local control really isn't happening because you have federal mandates, and all of the states get money if they satisfy the federal mandate. So we really have to get the federal government out of that. In response to something Governor Weiss said, insofar as it being elected officials that are making the decisions. Actually, when you've got the U.S. Department of Education putting all kinds of directives toward the states, those are unelected bureaucrats that are actually making policies that we have to abide by. So if we could get that down on the local level, I think we can probably all agree on the local control, because I know both of the other two panelists have talked about that. One of the things that I do see happening, though, is parents aren't involved or aren't allowed to be involved in many aspects, especially with the curriculum. Our country has moved away from teaching the basics so that we can excel and be prepared for the workplace, and they've moved into social engineering. We've got a lot of socialism in the public school curriculums, and much of that is coming down from the federal level as well.
Well, you've raised a great question, and I want to address this to you, Governor Wise, if I may.
But could I hear an example of what social engineering or socialism is?
For one thing, history has been rewritten to take out the Christian influences of history, the Judeo-Christian base of our founding fathers. We also have sex education that's mandated in Massachusetts after same-sex marriage was legalized. That's being taught as normal in the public schools. That violates the religious beliefs of a whole host of different religions, and you're getting things like that the parents don't know about. I talked about pastors.
And if I may chime in a non-religious example, Governor Wise, would be in California, where they have reduced substantially the amount of American history taught, and they've replaced it with all kinds of sex education and homosexual lifestyle education. And to replace American history with that is probably qualified social engineering.
The irony of that then is that's done at the local level, or perhaps at the state level, but that's not coming from the federal government, because the usual complaint I hear, and Barb raised this the usual complaint I hear about the federal government is that through No Child Left Behind, it has forced more focus on English and math, because those are the two subjects that schools are held accountable for under the federal system. It's forced more concentration on that, and thus people aren't able to focus as much on history or the arts or other areas. So if what you're mentioning in California, that's not coming from the federal system by any means. But schools, I think, still. So
the question I was going to ask you, actually,
sure.
Because it all wraps up into this, is whether or not, at the very beginning we talked about the purpose of education and how we all indeed agree that we want to have good education, so we're on the same page there. It's the question of what constitutes that. And is the U.S. Department of Education, Barb is correct, there is nothing expressed in the Constitution that allows for the creation of such jurisdiction federally. So is the U.S. Department of Education is it helping to further the causes of a good education, or is it something, there's a lot of talk about dismantling it over the years, is it something that is interfering with the course of good education, in your opinion?
I happen to be one who believes that the federal department, there is a federal role, and the U.S. Department is assisting, and indeed right now it is assisting, I believe, because what it's doing is actually providing states some flexibility that most states are requesting from No Child Left Behind. It's doing it through its regulatory authority. States are now applying to be let out from under some of the more rigid provisions of No Child Left Behind that force them to operate in a one-size-fits-all. The other part is there's a historical role to the U.S. Department of Education, and that is the main program that the department has is something called Title I, which is funding for large concentrations of low-income students, and the department has tended to always focus where the states either could not or would not be able to focus resources. So when states weren't able to focus attention, resources to large concentrations of low-income children, the department assisted states to do that. The department assisted, for instance, for a while with reading programs and other areas like that. And so, and there's another area that I think is critical. So regardless of where people come down on the issue of the department's direct involvement, this nation desperately needs educational research on, not research that is federally dictated about what it's going to be and what the outcomes are going to be. But no state has the capacity to keep looking at what are the best practices that really get the kind of improvements that we're all talking about needing for our children. The U.S. government, that's one area at relatively little cost and relatively little direct influence that where the government can be the help states with that, help states with the funding for it, and then be the repository, not in the sense of controlling what the results are, but at least making sure everyone, wherever, no matter the largest or smallest school district they're in, has access to it.
Thank you.
Brent, could I jump in just a second?
Yes, real quick, we're coming up on a break. Go ahead.
Okay, and it goes back to every state creating the programs and curriculum that they want, and as Barb said, that I think California may choose something very different than Iowa, but it is still done at the state level, not the federal level. And as a school board member, I voted on what kind of sex education was offered in our district. So that was as close to the parents as possible, and they could unelect me every 3 years if they didn't like what I was instituting.
All right. Excellent. Thank you. Several states have enacted legislation prohibiting homeschooling or severely restricting it, but some have actually said prohibiting it. Why do some states seem so opposed to allowing parents to educate their own children as they see fit?
It boils down to two things. It boils down to money and control. They want the money and the control are the big motivators for just about anything. In our United States, thanks to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and cooperation with states, homeschooling is legal in every state. Some states highly regulate homeschooling, and some states have no regulation at all. And it is absolutely amazing because statistical studies have been done over a period of decades, and it shows that the amount of government regulation, whether it's heavily regulated or no regulation at all, the test scores of those students are almost exactly the same. The regulation has no influence or effect at all on the outcome of the students that are home educated. So we, as state organizations and as national organizations, are trying to get the message out that, look, over 2 decades, we've proved ourselves. Homeschoolers are about at the 86th percentile on average, with public school kids at the 50th percentile. We really don't need to be regulated. It's kind of interesting.
Well, now, hang on, because I want to toss this over to the governor. Okay, just for a moment, because I want to see this other perspective. Governor, you were governor, so you have state house experience, and you were congressman, so you have legislative experience. Why is it that some states seem so opposed to allowing parents to educate their own children as they see fit?
My experience, and certainly that in West Virginia, was that we did permit homeschooling. I think that we had the right balance of regulation versus flexibility. I'm a little confused in terms of a money issue. It's the parent is already paying the property taxes that go, or whatever the state.
What I'm
that's
asking,
not an issue.
No, I understand in West Virginia this was not an issue, but I'm asking from your experience in the positions of legislator and in the state house. Can you extrapolate why some states do really want to make it hard to homeschool?
The argument that would be made is that, and Barb uses some information to refute it. The argument that would be made is it's important to make sure that there is at least a minimum level of education, and that increasingly we're seeing a higher level of education required for young people to be able to make it into today's society. And so the state has to make sure that that's achieved. Can that be done in a homeschool environment? Can it be done in a charter school environment, private schools and public schools? Okay.
Now, let me segue over to you, Ann, because no discussion on education would be complete, okay, if we did not ask the question about the appropriate place of religion in education. Why is it that so many educators in public school take issue with students expressing faith in a Christian God, yet allow them time away, for example, from the classroom to worship Allah as part of their Muslim rituals? Why do educators prohibit prayers mentioning Jesus while allowing special Wicca days in the school calendar. This seems like it's very clearly unbalanced. Can you explain that?
Well, Brent, I'll comment on it. I don't know if I can explain it. I can explain my own experience and what I've seen in a lot of places, and that is that in public schools, there are opportunities for students to express their religious convictions, their religious expressions. There are times and places that are written into policy that they can do that. What can't happen necessarily is that kind of expression takes place during academic hours.
Why not? No, just a moment. Why not? There is absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says separation of church and state. It is a policy established based upon a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to a Baptist minister, okay, where he talked about a wall of separation between church and state. Why is it that if I'm sitting there, if I'm a Muslim and I'm sitting there and I wish to pray, they're not going to stop me because they'll make a big issue. If I'm a Christian and I wish to pray, why should it be a big, as long as I'm not...
Well, I'm not sure that any Christian or Muslim is stopped from praying. I think what we're talking about is a school having to have the regulation of the day and what fits into time and getting accomplished what their mandate is to accomplish. So if it is an official group or a club or a Christian Bible study or anything else, then that has to be scheduled. But I think spontaneous expression does take place in public schools, and I think it takes place in various programs. I think what happens is that the expression that takes place is reflective of a pluralistic student population that come from all the major religions of the world. And so it will never be exclusively one over another, but I don't think at all that means that students don't have the right to religious expression. So I think that just depends on how you view the expression itself.
Okay. Governor Wise, again, you have both executive and legislative experience, so it gives you a unique perspective on this. To my naive eyes, to my simplistic vision, it seems there's a real bias against Judeo-Christian ethic and in favor of other philosophies and faith. Am I imagining that? Am I really imagining that, or is there something going on?
No, I don't agree that there is. I think that Anne stated it well. And, for instance, I often have heard this thing about, children are punished because they pray over their food. As somebody once noted, children pray over every test, regardless of what faith they are. There's nothing about to stop the spontaneous expression or prayer. And, indeed, I'm one who believes that really is. We've talked about the role of parents. It seems to me that in terms of instilling religion and encouraging religious observations, that's the parents' job. I want that done with the parents. I want it done with their ministers, their priests, whomever. I don't think that's the job for the public school teacher.
Okay, and Barb, can you comment on the same thing, the issue of religion in education or not?
Yeah, I'll comment quick, and then I've got two decisions I wanted to read. One is your faith permeates all of life, and so it can't be separated out of your life and not put in a curriculum, because that is the foundation of what we study from. It boils down to your worldview. What is the basis of how you start with education? As a Christian, I start with Genesis. That's the basis of our education, and it's permeated through everything. But I want to read you real quick. This is two things. One from the United States Congress, 1782. Congress passed this resolution. The Congress of the United States recommends and approves the Holy Bible for use in all schools. Then 110 years later, this is a Supreme Court decision, U.S. Supreme Court. It says our laws and our institutions must necessarily be based upon and embody the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind. It is impossible that it should be otherwise, and in this sense and to this extent, our civilization and our institutions are emphatically Christian. This is a Christian nation.
And This is an increasingly diverse nation, which has grown because of its diversity. And even within Christian religions, there are great differences. That's why in Rhode Island you had one group of Christians. In Maryland you had Catholics. And you had a number that were seeking freedom, sometimes from each other. And so the diversity. I'm a great believer that many faiths, there are many ways to get to the same place. And in an increasingly diverse nation, we need to recognize that, respect it, not to repress it, and that expression, but to respect it and to respect there are a number of different faiths and not to be mandating one way of expression.
I completely agree, and not be restricting any one way of expression either.
And Brent, could I just say one more thing quickly? I think it's incumbent on school districts to make sure that they treat all students, all families, and their faith in a fair and correct way. And that has a lot of implication. That means you understand everybody's religious holiday. You make sure that you plan a school calendar based on that. And that's not a simple thing today, but I think schools have to try to do that, and I think that most of them do.
Excellent. Some comments from the chat room from Kat. The schools did not teach my children discipline. They learned repetitive discipline from ballet and dance and piano lessons. Teacher used to tell me how easy it was to teach my children because they did their homework and had a few better listening skills in the classroom. But it wasn't the schools that taught them the discipline that made school easy. From Theocrat. Ask the panelists if they're aware of Charlotte Iserbyt's book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. Panelists?
I am not.
No, I'm not.
Charlotte Iserbyt, he's a former Ronald Reagan Department of Education senior official, and she learned that the education system, according to her research, was being modeled after the Soviet and Chinese systems, and she wrote a 900-page book with all kinds of documentation on that. And that's the book Theocrat's mentioning. From Deputy Donut, teaching them that some kid has two mommies and setting that up as an okay lifestyle is not any of the public schools' business. Anne, how do you respond to that?
Well, I can understand her feeling there, and that would be something that would be a very isolated thing. I visit with schools across the country all the time, and I don't run into that, and so I can't comment that it did or didn't happen, but I think that was what we would call a very local thing, and I think we would have to ask them why that happened.
I want to ask you a sense. Go ahead, Barbara.
I see that all over the place. I mean, I as a state leader in Iowa, I connect with people nationally, and people are leaving the public schools to homeschool for that very reason. It's not an isolated incident at all. It's mandated in many places, increasingly. To the book that you were talking about, there's a similar book called Dumbing Us Down, and that's by John Taylor Gatto. It's a quick read, and it is an excellent book. A more thorough investigation by the same publisher is called The Underground History of American Education. And that's a very, very, that'll take you a long time to read, but excellent information.
Thank you.
I think this points out, again, what we said earlier about not isolating schools like everything that's happening doesn't have something to do with our society at large. I think we have to look big picture whenever we look at anything that happens in a school.
I think you raise an excellent point, and there's going to be debate about the chicken-egg syndrome. Is society becoming less moral because of the education system, or is the education system becoming less moral because of society? And philosophers have debated that, variations on a theme for thousands of years. But I think you raise an excellent point. A sensitive issue, but I think one that's important when we talk about education, involves the teachers' union. This is one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Now, I know of one particular circumstance, a public school teacher in New Jersey, and she was fired for being incompetent and for being a danger to her students. She took it to court, the union took it to court, and in court, they proved that she was incompetent and dangerous to her students in 2 of her 3 classes. Because they couldn't prove it in the third, the judge ordered the teacher to be rehired, thereby placing students at risk. Now, I mean, that's granted, it's more of an extreme circumstance, but do you believe, and I want to start with you, Governor Wise, that the charter for the teachers union should either be revoked or in some way the teachers union should be limited in how it can influence the education system?
Well, I think we have to make sure that everybody agrees, including the unions, that this is about what's best for the child. And what I'm seeing is, yes, there are some incidents such as you mentioned that I've experienced, but I'm also seeing a consensus rapidly growing that the teacher unions need to adjust just like everyone else has adjusted in this economy. And so I'm seeing collective bargaining agreements, for instance, that have different types of performance pay, that do away with the old tenure system, which incidentally protects teachers in situations such as you said, which make it much easier to fire teachers. But the key as well is yes, we want to focus on getting the bad ones out. We also want to recognize that we've got 1 million new teachers coming on board within the next few years, and the important thing is also what is it we need to do to support and make sure we get into our classrooms the teachers that can truly be effective.
All right, excellent. Ann, would you comment on the teachers union issue? Do you think that the union has too much influence on what's going on in the public schools?
Some states don't have unions, and I've seen things go just as well there, but I think, as Governor Wise said, I think we're in an era right now where there's no one and no group that is not going to have to adjust and react to current realities. But again, it needs to be child-centered, and we always need to do what is best for the child because that's the reason we have teachers. Having said that, I think as a nation we have to do a better job of lifting up our teachers. We have to honor teachers who give their lives teaching our children. That does not mean that you don't remove the ones who need to be removed because there has to be a clear and available process to do that. But I think that we need to bring honor back to the teachers because they're the ones spending their lives with our children, and we need teachers. We need quality teachers.
Excellent. Final comment from the chat room, Deputy Donut. Do away with the public school funding by the feds and do away with the NEA. All right, panelists, final comments. You got about 30 seconds. Start with you, Barb.
Okay, I guess I'll go back to the NEA. I really think that we should we rely on professional organizations that are not unions. That's happening in states that are right-to-work states. There's a very successful one here in Iowa. I want to encourage, as a last comment, everybody to look into homeschooling, to go to a homeschool conference in your state. People that have gone are just totally overwhelmed. They had no idea what this was like. You can go there if you aren't thinking about homeschooling because there's so many workshops that you can use in your home with your children. And
I got to cut you off. You off. We're just about out of time. Ann Foster, 30 seconds.
Yes, we have 90% of our kids in public schools. For that reason, we all have to be interested in them and support them. There is no silver bullet that will fix everything, but what we do know that works is quality teaching, strong administrative leadership, adequate funding, safe facilities, and engaged parents and community. If we could get all of those things to be true in every public school in America, we would see great results, and that's what we need to work towards.
And the final word, Governor Bob Wise.
And I think the two prior to that said it so well, but let me just add, it's very clear that the economic and civic future of our country depends upon the quality of our education. And that's wherever, regardless of where you're educating, we have to make sure that all of our students have an excellent learning outcome. And Brent, thank you for this alternative format. I think this is a wonderful way to have a sustained discussion with a wide-ranging audience.
And thank you, Governor Wise, Ann Foster, and Barb Hecky. Thank you, panelists. It's been a fantastic time.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll stay in touch with each other as well. God bless you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.